This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I would like to welcome all of you to our webinar series, Conversations on Constitutional Design. In Conversations on Constitutional Design, we discuss the relevance and effectiveness of constitutional design in the management of divided societies, with African states and their constitutions as our primary focus. We invite scholars that analyze the various options that are available for constitution makers in reordering the state in the context of a very deeply polarized society. My name is Jonathan Fissa. I'm a professor of law at the University of the Western Cape and currently the holder of the UWC Research Chair on Constitutional Design for Divided Societies. Today's conversation focuses on ethnic federalism, that is the constitutional option of creating a federal system along ethnic lines, the appropriateness of creating subnational units whose boundaries correspond with ethnic differences. And we do so in the context of the experience and debates that are happening in parts of Asia. And to provide us with the Asian perspectives, we are joined by Dr. Michael Breen, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Michael, thank you for joining us. It's very late in Michael's part of the world, 9 p.m. So thank you for really making the time to join us. Just a few words to introduce our guests. Dr. Breen currently teaches at the University of Melbourne. His research focuses on federalism, political parties, and electoral systems in Asia, the management of ethnic diversity, and deliberative democracy in constitution making and conflict management. So previously, Michael was a policymaker and a project manager in various government departments in Australia and international organizations, including the UNDP. Michael has advised on federal constitution making projects in Nepal, Myanmar, the Philippines, and major policy reforms in Australia. So Dr. Breen has 30 minutes to make the presentation. And after that, we will have 30 minutes for questions and comments. And you can use also the chat box for comments and questions. So with these words, it is now my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Breen. And so the virtual floor is yours, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fisher, for the invite and the kind introduction. I'm also very grateful for the accommodating of the time difference, which is very much appreciated. So as Professor Fisher outlined, I'll be giving some perspectives from Asia and focusing on the issues around ethnic federalism and questions about how you design those federal boundaries. Now, I have, as has been mentioned, look at electoral systems, political parties, and given the time that we have, I won't go into much detail on those things or on several countries, but feel free to ask me questions about some of the other countries facing challenges in Asia and potentially some of the other institutions. I'd be happy to do my best to answer those. So I'll just give a quick outline of what I'm going to cover today and get the slides to move. So I will give a brief introduction to federalism in Asia, and then I just very quickly definitions around ethnic and territorial federalism, because using those terms so much in this presentation, I think it will be important to be clear what I mean by that. Then what I'm going to do is focus on the federalism debate in Nepal. And this really ended up coalescing or going around ethnic versus territorial federalism for many years. Then I'll talk about ethno-territorial federalism and overcoming polarization as some of the ways to move past this impasse that ethnic and territorial federal debates have led to in Asia. So to give a bit of background, Asia, like many parts in the world, is experiencing somewhat of a federal resurgence. So we can look back in the last 10 years and we can see the establishment of a new federal constitution and a new federal country in Nepal, elections at 3 levels of government, quite substantial transformation. But we also see attempts at federalization that have not succeeded and have been halted. So Myanmar established a constitutional reform process, and the aim was to establish what they call a genuine federalism. By that, they mean a democratic federation. Sri Lanka established a constitutional assembly to resolve the national question. And by the national question, they meant federalism. You may also note it's a constitutional assembly and not a constituent assembly, so it still would have had to have gone through a referendum process. The Philippines released a draft federal constitution. I think many people know about then President Duterte's election promise to eliminate drugs, and he started a war on drugs and many human rights abuses as a result of that. His other promise that helped get him elected was to turn the country federal, although he ended up dropping that agenda and has since been served his term. And the Solomon Islands has also resolved to become federal, but seen little action towards implementing that. So when we look at Asia, we can say that federalism has come or is coming in 3 generations. The first generation is arisen out of the decolonization and state building process following the end of World War II and the withdrawal of a lot of colonial powers from the region. They are federation type systems with more or less constitutionally sovereign units with key ethnic dimensions. And here I'm talking about India, Malaysia, and Pakistan. So very long-standing federal countries. The second generation is what I call federal features in unitary states. And so this is where you have really distinct federal constitutional designs, but the state remains unitary and there's still intervention powers, for example, or substantial intervention powers. And these are done for conflict resolution and special autonomy and involve special autonomy and substantial constitutional decentralization. The 2 main countries I talk about here are the Philippines and Indonesia. You could put China in the same category, but China is difficult to compare to some of these other countries because of the substantially different regime types, and also it's gone backwards a lot in many of these respects in the last while. And then the third generation is emerging type of federal systems coming out of regime change and alliance making. And the examples here are Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. So federalism in Asia has also been associated with a democratization agenda, at least in the more recent years. And so what you can see here is a map of basically how federal those 8 countries are and how democratic those 8 countries are, with the blue line representing democracy and the black line federalism. And you can see 3 distinct periods almost. You see the initial post-war period where you had high levels of democracy in mostly unitary states. Then you had a lot of democratic reversions, authoritarian military regimes, and again, no federalism. And then the reintroduction this time around, in this third period, has been coupled with the introduction of federalism. And this is because the extreme ethnic diversity and ethnic division in the countries in question, the unitary democracies have just not really proven feasible and effective in managing the diversity and the different aspirations of different communities. Another key trend that we see in Asia is an increase in how they acknowledge ethnicity in their federal systems. So this is a fairly simple measure here. The grey line represents how much ethnicity is basically drawn into the system through things like where the boundaries are, how much of an ethnic population is included in each state, whether they're named after a particular ethnic group, those sorts of things. And again, you can see that that has been going up at the same time as federalism. In other words, federalism in Asia has very strong ethnic character, and I don't think it could really be any other way. So I've said ethnic federalism a lot, so just to be clear, when I contrast two kinds of federalism, ethnic and territorial federalism, and these are the terms and the contrasts that are also made in the region. So the arguments are about whether we should have territorial federalism or ethnic federalism. And territorial federalism, I've put 4 features here. Your boundaries are ethnically neutral, like they don't consider ethnic distribution. They're drawn instead on the basis of factors like geography, economic resources, infrastructure. And the aim is to ensure that the provinces are viable and broadly similar. So they're looking at symmetrical type of federal systems. And there are no special rights for ethnic groups or provinces, and there is basically legal neutrality. Ethnic federalism, on the other hand, we have boundaries that are based on ethnicity and drawn to include as many of an ethnic group as possible and a few of other ethnic groups as possible, which means provinces may be different in size, power, and resources. And they will also tend to have special rights like language rights, or even be able to have political prerogatives like ensuring that the chief minister of the province is from that particular ethnic group. Also known as multi-nation or multinational federalism and ethno-federalism. So turning now to the case study briefly. So Nepal is a hugely diverse country. It has more than 100 different ethnic, caste and language groups, and it's actually a really, really complicated system where groups used to be formally ranked. There was a government code that ranked all the different groups, and where you rank depends on both your ethnicity and your caste, if your particular ethnic group has a caste system. If you're not familiar with the caste system, it's like a Hindu-based system of ranking or organizing people that is more or less based on occupational fields, but you have a hierarchy. However, despite that diversity, Nepal has been historically ruled by one dominant group, which we might call the higher caste Pahadis, or high caste Hindu groups from the hill region. Now, they're only 28% of the population, but they have managed over centuries even to capture most political, social, and economic infrastructure. And coupled with this has been a history of centralized authoritarian rule. Up until after World War II, Nepal started off as a kingdom, then it became basically like a family-run oligarchy, and then it became a kind of a hybrid state, then a democracy that was short-lived, then it went back into an authoritarian system under the king. It had another go at a democracy. It was a unitary democracy in 1990. That lasted for about 10 years, and then the king took power again, and they have become democratic again. So coupled with this centralized authoritarian rule is a huge, there's a lot of remote areas that are very, very underdeveloped and very hard to access. Many places you can only get to in a helicopter or by walking, sometimes walking for upwards of 10, 15 days. And so all these factors led to a civil war being waged by a Maoist party, and that civil war lasted for about 10 years. In 2006, there was a comprehensive peace agreement signed between the political parties and the Maoists after they worked together to depose the king. And that set up a constitution-making process that lasted for 7 years. And in 2015, they established a federal, secular, and democratic republic. So quite remarkable transformation. 4 huge changes all at once: federalism, secularism, democracy, and a republic. And the political science literature would tell you that you can't have so many major changes at once and that these sort of things happen incrementally. But Nepal has so far, there are people inside the country, of course, who are dissatisfied with progress. But it has been 7 or 8 years since that constitution came in, and it has passed a lot of tests so far. And I think the future is looking bright. So the new constitution was, in a sense, supposed to be a cure-all for all of Nepal's problems. And you can see this quote from the then president in 2010. The new constitution is meant not only to establish Nepal as an exclusive secular and federal state, but also to provide clear avenues for conflict transformation, restorative justice, reconciliation, development, and efficient leadership. So to develop the new constitution, they had constituent assembly elections, and the Maoist rebels turned into a political party and ran in those elections. And there were some long-standing democratic parties that had been around for decades, sometimes in exile, sometimes in power. And they were expected to win, but the Maoists won the most seats, and it was a huge surprise. I was living in the country at the time, and it was a shock to everyone. There were obviously so many people who had voted for the Maoists, but still no one expected them to do so well. So this really gave a push for some of those demands that the Maoists had, amongst those a demand for ethnic federalism. And then the Constituent Assembly, the first act was to declare a federal secular democratic republic. However, they couldn't reach agreement on the constitution, and it was dissolved in 2012 after multiple extensions. They had a new election in 2013, and those older democratic parties won the most seats. And they adopted the progress that had been made on the previous constitution, which had resolved almost all the disagreements, but federalism was the remaining issue. And federalism, if the constitution was a cure-all, then federalism was even more so. And so you can see here this quote: to carry out an inclusive, democratic, and progressive restructuring of the state by ending the current centralized and unitary form of the state, to address problems related to women, Dalits, Indigenous people, Janajatis, Madeshis, oppressed, neglected, and minority communities and backward regions by ending discrimination based on class, caste, language, gender, culture, religion, and region. So that's quite a demand for federalism to address. And the way they sought to address it was largely through this ethnic federal design. So most areas in Nepal are occupied by, or many areas outside of the central regions, by ethnic minorities who want autonomy and self-government. I've mentioned the uneven development, poor regions, and this kind of extreme centralization. And so enabling ethnic autonomy and spending on local priorities, tailoring policies to local contexts, making it easier to participate. I'm sure you've heard many of the reasons that this kind of federalism might be promoted. But some interesting aspects were that they agreed to have 3 levels of government, so similar to South Africa, but very few federal countries have 3 levels of government in the constitution in the same way that South Africa and Nepal do. And that includes having a division of powers between each of those levels. And so the constitution includes schedules with concurrent powers and exclusive powers for each levels of government. And they agreed those powers within a year or two without much controversy, which I still find remarkable, but they could not agree on how to draw the new provinces. So part of this is Part of the problem is to do with the process of federalization. So federalism in the West is mostly coming together, whereas modern federal countries are kind of holding together federalism in response to conflict. And so that means that you're devolving power from the center to the units. And you'll end up with usually a stronger center and weaker units, residual powers with the center. But importantly, units that have an ethnic character and less symmetrical units. And when you have a country like Nepal that did not have this intermediate level, they need to draw boundaries from scratch pretty much. And so this was the big challenge. And there was a lot of vested interest involved, as I'm sure you can imagine. So the federalism debate basically came down to ethnic federalism versus territorial federalism. Ethnic federalism was meant to capture identity and historical continuity, and territorial federalism, viability and geography. And in a basic sense, the less states you had, such as in the bottom diagram, the more viable they could be, but the less ethnicity would be recognized. And the more states you had, such as in the top diagram, the more ethnicity could be recognized, but the less viable they would be. So if you see, for example, this Jadon province in the very top of the top map, this had, I think, less than 100,000 people in the province, basically no infrastructure, no economy. It's the kind of place you need to walk to or ride a helicopter to. It's mostly mountainous areas. A lot of it is inhabitable because it's just too high altitude. But there was a Jadon ethnic group, and that ethnic group involved in this map making was very prominent. So ethnic federalism polarized the whole country. It wasn't just the politicians, but people on the streets were, there were riots and protests going on between advocates of either side. Advocates of ethnic federalism said it was a magic bullet, and opponents of ethnic federalism said it would lead to disintegration and the breakup of the state, which is one of the key criticisms generally of ethnic federalism because of historical events like, for example, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Russian Federation, where these kind of ethnic federal states have indeed broken up. But the situation in Asia is, of course, quite different. So to progress their constitution-making process, Nepal implemented a participatory process involving all the major groups. At the center of it was the Constituent Assembly. They used dialogues where people and members of the Constituent Assembly went around and held deliberations in all regional centers and smaller towns as well. They had questionnaires. There was around 500,000 questionnaires returned from the public. Thematic committees dealing with different aspects of the Constitution, and cross-party caucuses also dealing with different identity-based issues. And so most issues were agreed after this deliberative process and adopted, except for federalism. And over time, the federalism, but because of this deliberative process, the federalism discourse was beginning to change. The political leaders were still playing politics, performative politics in the Constituent Assembly, like you can see in the top picture, and then making decisions over a cup of tea in the Prime Minister's house, like you can see in the bottom picture. But they had to listen to what the people wanted. And what the people wanted was not any of these extreme options that were being put by the politicians who were demanding one or the other. The society was gradually becoming less polarized. And at the start of the debate, no one was talking about mixed solutions. It was just one or the other. But by the end, after some years, people started to talk about mixed solutions, and then the politicians and the media followed. And so you can see here, what I did was I used some survey sources about people's attitudes towards the type of federalism, and then also looked at reviewed media articles. And so they're proxy measures, of course, but the level of support for territorial federalism was continually going up. And this was coupled with it becoming more mixed. And at the same time, the number of states agreed by decision makers was continually going down. And so they map almost perfectly. So you can see that influence, and you can also see how it actually worked in practice. So the final map that they came up with had 7 provinces, and they mix viability and identity. And the idea, I don't know how well you can see in this map, but the shading is different major ethnic groups. The idea they went with in the end was to have 2 major ethnic groups in each province to increase the viability, but change that balance of power and create new majorities and give those ethnic groups greater autonomy. And the other thing was the strong local government system. So the local government is actually arguably stronger than the provincial governments. And this enables the ethnic autonomy to be more targeted, because when you have 100 plus groups, of course, you cannot have 100 plus provinces in a country like Nepal, but you can have many local governments. They also went with a parliamentary system, which was a controversial issue for some time, and 2 houses of parliament in the central government that is representative of the provinces as well as the local governments. And so turning more broadly to Asia, this is actually a pattern that you see right across the region, with varying levels of success and varying levels of application. But it's what scholar Liam Anderson has called ethno-territorial federalism. And it's characterized by essentially by splitting the dominant ethnic group across multiple provinces. So you avoid this problem with bipolar federations, which you can argue is actually what led to the collapse of federal systems in Yugoslavia, in Russia, in Czechoslovakia, in Pakistan, when it was East and West Pakistan. These type of federal systems are unstable, but ethnic federal systems are not inherently unstable. It comes down to the design. And the way to mitigate that risk of secession and state breakup is to create this kind of ethno-territorial design. So the map here is Myanmar. Myanmar has other issues, of course, beyond just the federal design questions. But you see the interesting bit here is the dominant groups, the Burmese or the Bama, are divided across 7 states, or what they call regions. And then major ethnic groups are consolidated more or less in 7 ethnic states that are named after those major ethnic groups. They also have special structures for smaller minorities, specifically non-territorial ethnic affairs ministries and self-administered zones for smaller groups. So now I won't go through this table, but I will share these slides with Professor Fisher afterwards, and I'm happy for them to be distributed so you can look a little bit more closely. But this goes across all the different countries that I've been interested in, including China. And you can see a lot of similarities beyond this ethno-territorial design. And I mention them briefly because they're part of a package and they make the ethnic federal systems more balanced and able to balance that autonomy and unity type objectives. And the key ones are the middle column electoral system, where there is a predominance of mixed member majoritarian type systems. And so this is where you have some aspects of first past the post plurality electoral systems, and some are proportional representation, but the majority are through first past the post. And you also have ethnic mixed party systems. So they allow ethnic parties, but they also encourage, incentivize, or even mandate bigger parties to be multi-ethnic and multi-regional, so you don't get this like dominant ethnic party ruling. And where that hasn't happened, such as in Sri Lanka, then you can see many of their problems directly linked to that pure ethnic party system. So that's one really key important thing is balancing that ethnic federal designs with the electoral and party system designs. And so what you end up with is this essential broad model of federal democracy in Asia. You have the holding together federal systems with a strong center. You have ethno-territorial federal designs. You have majoritarianism. And you have ethnic and multi-ethnic political parties, including using political engineering for that reason, political party engineering. Another important lesson that has come out of this comparative research, in particular some additional research I've done with Professor Baogang He from Deakin University, is about the sequencing of federal systems. So I'm sure you're aware there's this tension between levels of government in federal systems, and this can be amplified by ethnic diversity. You have different interests in the center and the peripheries. And so you can manage that by party systems, as I've mentioned, intergovernmental institutions, or by coercion. But one of the best ways, of course, is this provincial boundaries. But having a pure territorial or a pure ethnic federal system basically does not work. All those federal systems that have done that have either in Asia have either changed them or they have reverted back to a more unitary system. So we think that this is kind of a law of Asian federalization. And an important aspect of that is starting with a more territorially focused design and then building in recognizing ethnicity over time. And this has been particularly exemplified by the case of India. And so you can see here on the map on the left, this is the original federal makeup of India. Now you don't need to look at it closely, but it was just in a couple of years, they started to make changes. So in 1953, they made some separations in the south to accommodate the different ethnic groups or linguistic groups is the term they tend to use. Then in 1956, on the left, there was a more fundamental reorganization. So they basically redrew most of the boundaries to align with different linguistic and ethnic groups. 1960, they did some more. Again, in 1966, up in the northeast. 1972, they did the northwest. 2000 and 2014, they've done some more. And you could also argue that it's been, again, repeated with Jammu and Kashmir, but it's a little bit more complicated. But this is the kind of approach that we think has really good prospects. Is stabilizing federalism, institutionalizing it to an extent, and then having the kind of constitution that enables you to be flexible and enables you to increase the recognition of different ethnic groups over time once those institutions are embedded or functioning more. So, all right, I was going to finish actually. I'll do a couple of minutes on the third point I wanted to make about overcoming this polarization. So I talked about the process in Nepal, this deliberative process. So myself and Baogang He got interested in this as a way of dealing with this ethnic territorial debate. But the theory on deliberative democracy says you can't have deliberation about issues around identity, fundamental design of the states. You can't do it in deeply divided states because you get more polarization. We didn't agree with that, and we wanted to prove it could work. And I'd seen it work in Nepal, so I knew that it would work here as well. And then we also wanted it to be an input into the constitution making process, which it was for a while. But what we did is we had 5 events, and we used a particular method called deliberative polling, which we adjusted a bit. But the basic idea is that you start off with a survey, and you find out what people think, like if they were answering a telephone opinion poll. And then you give them some balanced and independently reviewed information. They learn about the issues, and then they come in and they deliberate amongst themselves. We have moderators at the tables, but we don't intervene and we don't influence them at all. They discuss, they do report backs, and then at the end of it, they do another survey and you demonstrate how people's opinions changed over time. And it was actually quite remarkable. It was far more change than I expected. And the change was happening even with ethnic armed organizations who were literally fighting each other and fighting the government for recognition of ethnic autonomy. They all moved the other way. And they said, at the start, most people were preferring ethnic approaches to federalism. But afterwards, the support for territorial federalism, which is the black dotted line, went up, and the opposition to ethnic approaches to federalism went down. And this was the same pattern across all 5 events, across no matter how we composed it, and across all the different ethnic groups. So it was really quite remarkable. And it really demonstrated that you can apply deliberative methodologies to facilitate opinion change, to address fundamental issues like national identity and the structure of the state, and to moderate the opinion of both laypersons and elites. And so here we can see, you know, the two kind of major groupings, the Burmese or the Bama and ethnic nationalities, continually coming closer together as a result of this process. So I will finish up there, just to say federalism is a key approach for managing ethnic conflict and division in Asia, and the polarization between demands for ethnic federalism and territorial federalism have impeded agreement making and institutionalization in many cases. But this polarization can be overcome by deliberative constitution-making processes, by developing hybrid forms such as ethno-territorial federalism, by sequencing territorial and ethnic factors, and ideally having a more flexible constitution that enables you to deal with that, and by balancing demands for unity and autonomy through encouraging multi-ethnic parties and mixed majoritarianism in electoral systems. So I look forward to any questions, and I have a very strong suspicion that many similar strategies have been tried in the Africa region, so I'd be very interested to hear any perspectives there as well. Thank you very much, and back to you, Professor Fisher.
Thank you very much, Dr. Breen. I think that was a very insightful presentation, and I'm also struck by the parallelism between the debates and the experiences both in Asia with what we have here on the African continent. I see a lot of similarities with experiences in Ethiopian Federation, but also in Nigeria and also in Kenya, and also your insight into the impact of deliberative process on the making of constitution, but also on the building of some sort of compromise or agreement on the issues. I think that would be very useful for many parts of Africa where, you know, these issues are still highly polarizing and highly influential in terms of the kind of politics that we see in those countries. So let me open up the floor for questions and comments. We have about, I think, 20 minutes. You can use the chat box to put on your questions and comments, but also you can raise your hands and then we'll allow you to address us directly. So questions and comments.
Or criticisms and concerns.
That's also welcome, yes. Let me start in the meantime, just to get it going. So one of the things that you talked about is about this ethno-territorial federalism. The idea that one way to address the challenge of ethnic diversity in these countries is to have this mixed system where some boundaries would be based on ethnicity, but others would be taking into account other factors. And at the center of that approach is the division of the large ethnic groups into a number of subnational units. And so we see that, for example, here in Africa, in Nigeria, where when Nigeria moved from a 3-unit federation to 36, it involved the division of the large ethnic groups into a number of states. And the same is with the system adopted in Kenya in 2010, where you have the large ethnic groups are not associated with one and only one counties, but actually they are divided into a number of counties where they are numerically dominant. So one of the questions that we often have in this kind of context is that would the large ethnic groups be willing to divide themselves into a number of subnational units? Because they might see that as a threat against their identity. They might see it as a threat to divide and rule. So would an ethnic group, a large ethnic group specifically, would they be open to that kind of arrangement? And so, for example, that you would have that debate, for example, in Ethiopia now, because in Ethiopia, as opposed to Nigeria and Kenya, what you have is a large ethnic group associated with one and only one state.
Yeah.
And if you would like to divide the large ethnic groups into a number of units, then there might be a strong resistance to that.
Yeah.
So that's one question. So let me pose that question, and then I'll come back.
Sure.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's a great question. And it's a really, I'll talk about Myanmar in a second, but the short answer is yes. The majority group, in my experience, has tended to be supportive of those kind of moves. And there are two main reasons. One is that the majority group has tended, or the dominant group has tended to, firstly, not really want federalism in the first place, and preferences not a unitary state. But if it is going to go for federalism, then it wants a territorial type of federalism. It doesn't want to bring ethnicity in the system because it's comfortable. It's got dominates the political institutions and the language and so forth. And so that kind of approach, where the majority group is divided up into a number of states, is consistent with that perspective. And I find that people are more worried about the makeup of the ethnic states than they are about the states where they are a majority, whether or not there's one or 7 of them. But it's really interesting to look at the Myanmar case specifically, because this is actually one of the biggest issues in their debates, which are still ongoing by people in exile. For those that don't know, Myanmar had a military coup in 2021 and is currently under a military regime. But federalism is still being negotiated on the sidelines. So what the ethnic group wants, ethnic groups, or the minority ethnic groups, is what we call the 8-state solution. So that is 7 ethnic states and then 1 big Bama core. And the reason that there's 2 reasons that they want that. One is because that was what they were promised by the founding father back in 1947. And so this promise has been reopened again and again. But the second is it changes the balance of power in the parliaments, in particular in the upper house of parliament. So it would make the ethnic states dominant if you have a system where each state gets equal representation in the upper house of parliament. So under that scenario, ethnic minority groups would have 7 times as many seats as the majority group. So many ethnic minority groups demand that there be 1 Burmese state, whereas the Burmese are demanding that there be 7. So yeah, so it is consistent with what people actually want, which is not very common in these kind of political negotiations.
Thank you very much. Tabi Singh, you have a question? Go ahead, please.
Good day, everyone. My question, I have two questions actually. The first one will be that it's federalism with its emphasis on the subnational autonomy, appealing for the political contenders in Asia in terms of their ethnicity. And then my second question will be that is representation when sharing the state power considered?
Okay, come again. I didn't get the last part. I don't know if Michael got it. Can you repeat your
The last,
question? Yeah.
should I repeat both?
Yes,
Yes,
maybe
please.
yes. I think.
Okay, the first one will be that it's federalism with its emphasis on the subnational autonomy, appealing for the political contenders in Asia in terms of their ethnicity. And then the second one is that is representation when sharing the state power considered?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
So the second
Thank you
one
very
is about power sharing at the center. Yes? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So great. So the demands for federalism have almost exclusively come from ethnic groups and ethnic minority groups wanting some kind of subnational autonomy. So it is absolutely central to all the federal negotiations. And some people would rather no federalism than a federalism that is not very much ethnically centered. And so a lot of it has come out of conflict as well. And basically, federalism in Asia, post those initial post World War II federations, are a result of ethnic conflict. And the government at the centre's hand has been more or less forced to do a wholesale reorganization or to give special autonomy, like is what has happened in the southern Philippines and parts of Indonesia. The second one, yeah, it's really interesting question actually, because people are not very interested in all of the places I've researched. I've done field research in maybe 7 or 8 of these countries, and people are not very interested in power sharing at the center. All people want to talk about is ethnic autonomy. And I would come do my interviews with my list of questions, and I just could not get engagement on issues of power sharing. So when it comes to like making final agreements, the political leaders, of course, are interested in power sharing, like the very high level political leaders, but more power sharing in the transitional sense. They're not interested so much in establishing these longer term kind of consociational arrangements where different groups get designated seats in executive governments and cabinets, for example. These things just aren't really on the agenda. And the theory, I mean, I think the basis is that people that believe once, you know, ethnic autonomy comes, then we will have the ability to have our say. We won't be pushed around anymore. We won't be oppressed and marginalized. We won't need representation in the center anymore. Having said that, they all think about these issues, in particular through things like reserved seats, through representation in the upper house, and through making multi-ethnic cabinets. There's a lot of intentional action towards incorporating people from different ethnic groups in executive governments. And there's a real tradition of like coalition executive government, even when the electoral results do not require a coalition. People tend to go into coalitions in order to get that cross-ethnic support base.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting because I think in Africa we have a demand more for power sharing arrangements as opposed to for autonomy. So it will be interesting to see why these different demands in the two continents. Questions and comments? We have, I think, about 10 minutes. I see a hand. Is that the old hand, or let me just check it. Please go ahead. Yes, Mituku, please go ahead, and then Christopher. Okay, Mituku, you can go ahead. I think your mic is muted.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you now. Go ahead, please.
Okay, my question is regarding the minority groups within the territorially allocated regions, which is established on the ethnic-based federalism. So how did you find it that those individuals who are outside their territory but are living currently in different ethnic-based territorial arrangement, how their right is arranged in the case at hand that you have discussed?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I understand correctly, it's how do the ethnic groups who are in another ethnic state that's not their own ethnic groups fare?
Yes,
Um,
yes, yes.
yeah. So I think it is more of a perceived risk than an actual problem in most cases. But it's not something that I've done specific research on, so it's difficult to answer definitively. But even though there are these large demands for ethnic autonomy, the most of the countries are really quite intermixed, and so there tends to be long-standing relationships among different ethnic groups. I don't think that you see as much. I don't think the divisions in Asia are as deep as they are in Africa between some in some places. So it depends a little bit on the overarching regime and whether human rights are protected strongly, and so where they are, you don't find so many issues. A couple of examples where there have been problems in Indonesia. There's a place that's introduced quite strict Sharia law, and so that has alienated some people in that area. In Sri Lanka, this was linked to the civil war. There was the forced removal of a lot of Sinhalese people from the northern province to try and make it a more homogenous Tamil province. And there has been in Nepal, there has been some cases where during the transition process where some ethnic groups have sought to collect a tax on those who are from the different ethnic groups, but that's been pretty much shut down. So there are things going on, but I wouldn't say that it's been a big problem. And yeah, I think it's talked about more than it's actually experienced.
Okay. I mean, so I think that's also another major difference then, because as Mutsuku was alluding to, one of the biggest problems that we have on the continent with respect to countries that have adopted federal arrangement or federal constitutions is that when you demarcate boundaries based on ethnic lines, or when a particular group is a dominant in a particular state or subnational unit, those who do not belong to that group often face discrimination, and in some cases even eviction and the threat of losing life and property because they are seen as guests. So it's also related. It's also made me wonder, because you say that in Myanmar, if I'm not mistaken, is where some of the subnational units are named after the ethnic group. And we have that in Ethiopia, but also I think to some extent in Kenya. And that has created a feeling where the state is defined as belonging to that dominant ethnic group, or the ethnic group after whom the state is named, and hence others are seen as guests at best, who might have to be tolerated, but even as outsiders that has to be evicted sometimes. And that has been the biggest threats and problems with the system. But maybe you can respond to that, add to that. But let me just give Christoph another opportunity to ask the question. Christoph, Professor Van der Broeken, thank you very much for joining us. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jota, Michael, thank you for this interesting event. I have one brief question. It is related to what you said, Michael, about the process in Nepal. At some point in the presentation, you mentioned that extreme options and demands dropped away and that the people became less polarized. From the later parts of the presentation, I understood that that may have been the impact of these deliberative processes. But I was wondering in Nepal, what other measures were taken to avoid, let's say, ethno-nationalist political parties from spoiling that deliberative process. Ethno-nationalist parties are often interested in increasing polarization, in increasing ethno-nationalism. So what kind of, it would be very interesting to look at the process in Nepal, and maybe you have done that, how people indeed increasingly came to adopt these more moderate stances, and how were these political parties dealt with? I think that it's really interesting to look at. Thank you. If you could briefly reflect.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they weren't spoilers as such. Nepal was very open with its political party process, and so it had some really interesting laws. But basically, that they allowed and enabled small ethnic parties to really play a prominent role. So they were given a voice in all those institutions. And because the process was working towards ethnic autonomy, they were happy to contribute to that process. But that's not to say that they didn't try to polarize society to an extent through protest movements and riots and the like in particular, and they were dealt with in a law and order sense, not necessarily very effectively. The main thing was they disallowed talk of secession. So any party that was threatening secession or had a policy for secession, they were banned, and one prominent person was jailed for quite some time. So they shut down those extreme options, but otherwise it was just the deliberative process that brought people together. I mean, the amount of cooperation amongst the parties that were once at war was really quite remarkable to see.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have, I think, 3 minutes. Kanisa, I have a question. Can you go ahead, please, Kanisa?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You speak about that the local people are more concerned about ethnic autonomy than any political power sharing. So I just wanted to know then, in mixed states, how was it ensured that the minority groups their rights were still protected in local institutions such as schools and hospitals and stuff like that? So how did they ensure that their rights were still protected and they were still looked after, and there was no friction or conflict in that regard?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, but I would say that it comes a little bit down to the structure that they chose. So I mentioned 100+ ethnic groups and the emphasis on local autonomy, and so the ethnic identity and making services more accessible to different ethnic groups could be addressed at the local level, because the local government in Nepal has enormous amount of powers in comparison to most local governments, including it has responsibilities for health and education, and the provinces play more or less a coordinating role. So they were able to express, just by nature of the fact that the communities are still somewhat clustered, so different ethnic groups would more or less control local governments and then be able to mold their education systems and health services to suit the language and cultural practices of the people in that region. So I would say through the local government, basically.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we have one question, and I think that's the last one. Perhaps we can end with that question, because it can speak to the whole debate about federalism. And I think the question that Shirley is asking is that federalism is often seen as something that undermines national unity in the context of a divided society. So is federalism a better option when compared to that autonomy that comes within the framework of a sort of a decentralized system of government, or is there not really much difference between the two options.
Yeah, so well, I think federalism has a much greater effect on the autonomy side for, I think, obvious reasons. But I guess the main point I'd like to make there is that federalism, at least in Asia, has come in response to disunity. And so it's not causing disunity, it's a response to disunity. And when you look at it, the situation improves because more people now feel more of a part of this political community, this political system. And so there's still elements of division and conflict and secession risks and all these things that you might expect to see. And you could blame it on federalism, but you've got to go back and look at why is federalism there in the first place? And would the situation be worse if there was no federalism? And almost invariably, the answer is yes, the situation would be worse if there was no federalism. There would be more conflict and there would be more disunity.
All right. Thank you very much. It's just on time. Thank you very much, Michael. That was a very insightful presentation, a lovely discussion. I think the discussion and your presentation has confirmed to me I think the relevance of discussing the Asian experience when it comes to federalism, to the kind of challenge that we face here in Africa. And it has shown that there are some parallel challenges, that there is some parallelism between the challenges that we see, but also the sort of the diverse approach that we have followed is also, I think, a very good insight into how we can reorder, redesign our institutional arrangements. And I think that was very useful. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed it and I've learnt a lot myself through those questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Prof, should I end for?
Yeah, I just want to
Okay, let me stop recording.